Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Whatever time it is of the day that you're watching this, I do hope that you're having a good one. With patch 5.58 having just released, that means that the new season of Feast, Season 20, is just about to start. If you're new to Feast or just want to know my opinion or the current class tiers and metas, then welcome in and let's go ahead and get started. To start off our tier list, we're going to go ahead and begin with our 3 healers. And obviously, why not start with White Mage, being the most iconic of the bunch. White Mage is by far the easiest healer to play, being very beginner friendly. It has extremely consistent healing, being focused on region. You can count on a White Mage to keep your team topped up all the way throughout a fight, and is really strong in coordinated team bursts with both Dia and your Afflatus Misery. That's not to say that the White Mage is perfect, just because it lacks a lot of utility in shielding, but is overall a very solid pick, and that's why it would go into the A tier. Astrologians are characterized by their cards and their divination to set up very strong burst windows for their team. Where they might lack consistency, where a White Mage has regions, they make up for in their ability to create huge comebacks and open up windows that no other healers can. The buffs in 5.58 have really made their strengths shine, but have not really fixed their weaknesses. And so while I do think that this patch, the Astrologian might take one step over the White Mage, it's not quite enough to propel them into the S rank. The Scholar is the direct opposite of Astro in almost every single way, being focused entirely on being a shield healer, and preferring to play a much more controlled style of game, as opposed to a bursty style of game. A Scholar thrives when their team can put up relentless pressure and capitalize on their consistent damage to run the enemy out of resources. While they may have been bottom tier last patch, they received a lot of buffs, especially a huge buff to the Resuscitation, giving them a 25% damage buff, and that's going to greatly help them be able to keep up pressure during a Feast match. Now transitioning into the ranged carries, we're going to go ahead and start off this list with the Bard. Now the Bard is an all-rounder. He's very easy to play, great consistent damage and team-wide utility in Wanderer's Minuet and his songs. But while he's pretty good at everything, he lacks an identity at being amazing at anything. And so while he is a very good pick in pretty much every single ELO bracket, he does lack any distinctive strengths. Now, I'm not entirely sure why Square Enix hates this class, but anyways, going into its strengths. Going into its weaknesses, it has a very telegraphed burst, allowing for quite a bit of counterplay. Its burst requires for the Machinist to get close up, which makes it susceptible to counterburst. Machinist doesn't really provide any team-wide utility, which means that although it does have like Tactician, other ranged physicals have better team-wide utility overall. So please, just if you love yourself, don't touch this class. Now Dancer is on the opposite side of the spectrum compared to Machinist. The Dancer is obviously focused on its dance partner, giving its dance partner pretty much every buff under the sun. And if you were to get an amazing melee that you know would pop off every game, then Dancer would very clearly be an S tier pick. But in a PvP setting, where there are so many variables, you don't know who your teammates are going to be, and also Dancer is much harder to pilot than something like Bard because of its proximity damage, you're definitely going to be looking at a much more inconsistent class, and simply because of the difficulty of piloting Dancer and the inconsistency of your teammates, it's definitely going to be more in the A tier, maybe a little bit above Bard, rather than the S tier. Now going into the ranged magical classes, they distinguish themselves from the ranged physical classes by having Phantom Dart, a 20% damage increase on a target for 6 seconds. This is extremely deadly, and makes the burst from magic parries very prevalent during a fight. Now, Black Mage is for players who love the flashy and high damage playstyle. They're very hard to play, have a lot of flexibility, and this gives them a very high skill ceiling. They have utility in their sleep, and they also have Phantom Dart, like the other magic users, creating really high damage burst windows. Now, their weaknesses include being able to be like LOS during their fire forecasts, and being very difficult to play overall as a class. So if you get behind on a Black Mage, it's very easy to snowball on them. Now, Red Mage is, compared to the other casters, a much more support-oriented caster, having access to Vercure to help their healers, and also having access to Embolden to help during burst windows, alongside Phantom Dart. Now, some of their biggest jarring issues are that the Red Mage has to be in melee distance in order to burst. Not only does that put the Red Mage in danger, but also the burst is not nearly as significant as the other two casters, and so that kind of playstyle can be very hard to pull off in a 4v4 setting. Now, Summoner distinguishes itself by being the only non-tank class to have its own stun, which is pretty much the most powerful form of CC. Given that Summoner takes a lot of setup in order to create a good burst window, but their burst windows, although taking a ton of time to set up, are the strongest by far. If you coordinate well with the melee to line up your burst windows, that's pretty much almost a guaranteed kill every single time. Given that, Summoner actually got a buff in 5.58, making their extended burst even that much more deadly, and given the ease of use of the class, I'm definitely going to have to say that it's an S tier class. Moving on to melee classes, the Samurai is definitely one of the most versatile melees out there. Because of the way that its gap closer works, you can use it both defensively and offensively, and this also lets you do some really cool things with your Midari and your Chiten, where you're naturally very scrappy with your Chiten paired with like your Bloodbath and your Arm's Length, but your Midari can be cancelled, and this can bait out a lot of mitigation for kind of like fake burst windows in order to switch targets. This is kind of where all the skill comes in for Samurai. It's a very fun class to play, and very versatile at that. Now, it doesn't have quite the outline strengths of Extreme Burst like Ninja or Monk, but overall it's a very solid class. Despite what anyone tries to tell you, Dragoon is it's not a melee class, it's a ranged class. So while Monk may have a lot of distinct strengths in being a very consistent and quick burster, given under its Riddle of Fire and Brotherhood windows, it also has some very distinct weaknesses, because a good player is able to recognize very easily when a monk is about to burst, and can be appropriately kited through CC. And once a monk goes in, it's very hard for a monk to come back out. So it can be a lot of trouble for a healer to kind of have to dump all their mitigation onto the monk, and then that leaves their range also vulnerable, having to engage alongside the monk. Now, if your burst is successful, then you have no issues. But when good players mitigate your burst, it can be very hard to outplay. Monks were also nerfed in 5.58, with 200 damage coming off their Chando kick, which is a very significant part of their burst, and while they may have been S tier last patch, they definitely have a ways to go to match up to the likes of Dragoon. Now finally for the DPS is the Ninja. And surprisingly last patch, Ninja did get a nerf to its Trick Attack, which is very surprising because Ninja was never particularly in a great place. Now Ninja really requires a lot of help from your team as a melee DPS, because its damage and execute comes from like your team initiating the fight for you and being able to follow up. And so as a ninja, it's really hard to solo carry. You're going to have to rely a lot on your team coordinating with you in order to get anything done. Now, if you can have these conditions fulfilled, then definitely Ninja can be a great class. But given that its burst is conditional, and not very easy to use, I would have to definitely say that Ninja is probably the worst melee in this current iteration. So while Dark Knight previously had a lot of issues with sustain, being probably the squishiest of the tanks, it always had a lot of great utility in its TPN and its off globals to provide healing reduction. But with the change to the delirium attacks in Quietus and Bloodspiller having new lifesteal upon them, this actually makes Dark Knight significantly tankier than previously, and while he may have been probably the weakest tank of the previous patch, I think this change is actually very huge and will propel Dark Knight to possibly the best or second best tank. Moving on to Gunbreaker, who also received very significant changes in 5.58. Gunbreaker always relied a ton on regen and on D&J to kind of provide tankiness. But with the changes to D&J, it definitely distinguishes Gunbreaker's strengths and takes away a lot of his omnipotence. Because by changing the duration of his detrimental effects and positive effects, this makes Gunbreaker much more focused as like a DPS tank and much less tankier by taking away taking away 3/4 of the duration of D&J in the defensive side. Now, pretty much the entirety of Warrior's kit can be summarized in 2 words. I'm going to let you guess what those 2 words are. The Warrior playstyle is very simple to play, but also relies heavily on an extremely strong offense while sacrificing a lot of team-wide mitigation. So when it's good, it's great, but it's very easy for teams that have a Warrior to capitalize on the lack of proper mitigation and consistent mitigation in order to punish and create strong counter bursts outside of IR. And so finally we get to Paladin, who is, of all 4 of the tanks, definitely the most defensive of the bunch. Paladin is the only tank with the proper invuln. I'm sorry Warrior, yours does not count. And has the tools to save your team when they're misplaying, because intervention is such a strong tool that can give up to 30% mitigation. So even if, for example, your melee is playing too aggressively, you have the tools to save them. This, paired with Configure's damage reduction, also really solidifies Paladin as really a tank that can have the tools to save a game. So thank you very much for watching. That is all to say, this is all my opinion. So if you think differently, definitely let me know. I'd really appreciate any feedback on what you thought about this tier list. But have a wonderful day. Thank you.